Okay, good morning, people. How are we doing out there? I see Thika's here. Good morning. Morning, KC. Morning, Baha. How are you doing? Morning, Jimmy. Morning, Caleb. And good morning, Duong. Who else is here? Jenna. Hi, Jenna. Um, okay, so hopefully a few more people will kind of trickle in shortly. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Um, yeah, first of all, let me ask you about the video that we saw. So, as I mentioned in Microsoft Teams, we have yesterday we were reading an article on psychological theories of prejudice and discrimination, and one of the things that came up in that article was Jane Elliott's kind of classic experiment in her class where she kind of she kind of created a new prejudice, right? She created a prejudice against people with blue eyes. And so it was a bit of a social experiment she conducted in her classroom, but she saw the kids started to behave in certain ways and connected to what's happening in the United States with the murder of George Floyd and all of the protests and kind of anger that are happening as a result of that and a result of many other things. As you saw, Jane was on Jimmy Fallon and was sort of talking to him. Good morning, Ivan. So maybe I'll start. What were your thoughts on that video? What did you think? What did you think about um, Jane's talk with? Good morning, Mashid. What did you think about Jane's talk with Jimmy Fallon? Um, for me, it was kind of an interesting interview. Actually, I didn't really know the backstory behind the experiment itself, so I didn't know why Jane had done it, and so of course she explained that. So that was kind of interesting. Um, what else did you think about that interview? Okay, so Karen says here, it was interesting that she gave the students a reason as to why she thought they were not smart, but the explanation is not true. Yeah, that was, Jane said that was an important part of it, right? Is that there was a rationale for why blue-eyed kids are not as smart as brown-eyed kids, but of course it's ridiculous, right? It's completely made up, and of course that's the criticism of racism in general, is that the differences between groups, whether they be between blue-eyed kids and brown-eyed kids or between white people and black people, those differences are made up. They're not real, right? So she kind of created a really good social experiment, and it was kind of reflective of what kind of happens in real life. Good morning, Manish. Casey says she's very intelligent. Yeah, she seems to be, right? And she's been teaching people about this for a long time, even though she kind of almost by accident she happened upon this approach, right? She was very upset about the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and so that kind of motivated her to um, teach a lesson to her students in this way. But it turns out it had significant effects for the students, but also significant effects for her, right? That was a period of American history where um, racism was probably, I don't know if you want to say stronger than today or not, that might be difficult to sort of compare them, but there was still a pretty significant amount of racism. And so Jane and her family and her children actually, there were a lot of negative consequences for them simply for her kind of supporting black people in their fight for equal civil rights at the time. Manish says, even after she tried to make a difference for the best, she had to pay consequences, and so did other people who stood up against racism. Yeah, that's true, right? Good morning, Lily. Yeah, she definitely did. The other thing I wanted to ask you before we kind of move on with this, and you can keep putting comments up here. I think that given what's happening in the United States now, and given that some of these issues have really been pushed to the forefront, maybe what we should do is change the order of our topics around a little bit, and maybe we should deal with racism first. I was going to do racism after a couple more units, but I think maybe we should just dive into it first, because it seems to be very topical. It seems to be very important to talk about right now. Good morning, Erica. And so, what do you think about that? Do you think we should deal with racism first, seeing as all of these things are happening currently in American and in Canadian society? What do you think? Stick with the plan or racism first? Casey said, yeah, we should deal with racism first. Okay. Yeah, so in the past I've kind of left racism closer to the end, because it's a little more, in some ways it's a little more complicated, but I think we're ready for it. I think we should just maybe dive into it. Manish says, yes, we can go with it right now. Okay. We have another day or so to just sort of tie up the loose ends on oppression and power, because we need to understand those things, and then we can probably jump into racism next week. Baha says, yes, because living in the situation will give us a better understanding. Yeah, I hope so. There's certainly lots of news and lots of lots of conversations about racism, about how it works, and particularly about how to fix it, because the problem is complicated, but also the solutions are complicated as well. But yeah, we can do that. We can deal with this. Okay, let's hop into our stuff today here. Okay, so yesterday you'll remember that excuse me, we started off talking about social groups, right? And I made a comparison to Mean Girls. I said that in the high school that Katie goes to, or that everyone goes to in Mean Girls, there are democracy sort of. It's a benevolent dictatorship, Baha. That's what it is. There are all these different social groups, okay, and Janice or Damien at the beginning of the movie, they kind of lay out all of the social groups in the high school. And what I said was, this was very similar to real societies, and that in kind of greater society we have social groups as well, and those social groups are sometimes organized according to race, according to economic or social class, according to gender or sexuality or religion. And just like in Mean Girls, these groups have different amounts of power. And the power relationship between two social groups, one with power and one with less or without, that relationship is called oppression, right? And so we said that oppression is a series of policies and practices and traditions and norms and all of this stuff that work together to systematically exploit one social group. Good morning, Sam. One social group over another. And we said that the group with power, the group that has advantages and opportunities because of this relationship, we're calling those the dominant group. And people who are exploited or who are denied opportunities or access to resources, those are minoritized groups, okay? Now, I didn't mention this yesterday, but I meant to, okay? So, oppression involves institutional control, okay? So, um, dominant groups usually have control of society's institutions like government and education and the media and family. Um, and it also includes ideological domination too. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Um, Ideological domination is the idea that dominant groups in society get to decide what social messages circulate, okay? And that's more complicated, and we'll get into that. I'll just probably in the next unit we'll get into that, okay? Um, and so what's happening here, and clearly what's happening in the United States, is that prejudice and discrimination are built into society, and it becomes automatic, and it becomes normalized, and it becomes taken for granted. And so this is an important thing to understand about oppression, okay? Is that no individual member of the dominant group has to do anything specific in order to oppress a member of the minoritized group, okay? So that's a bit of a tricky one. And what I'm saying is that if you think of society like a machine, we're all kind of born into different parts of the machine, and we all kind of serve a different function. And when we're talking about oppression, when we're talking about an oppressive relationship between social groups, we're talking about a way in which society operates to benefit some people and disadvantage others. And so no one really has to do anything specific. So if we're talking about race, for instance, nobody has to be racist in order to be in an oppressive relationship with other people in the society, okay? Here's an example. Here in Canada, for instance, probably the most obvious racial oppression going on for us is Indigenous Canadians, so First Nations people here in Canada, and non-Indigenous Canadians, okay? So non-Indigenous Canadians, more specifically probably white European people. White European people have power in Canadian society. We control the government, we control the media, we control education, and so on. And so white European Canadians are in an oppressive relationship with Indigenous Canadians. White European Canadians have power, social and economic and institutional power, and for the most part, Indigenous people do not. And so me, as a member of the white Canadian group, I am in an oppressive relationship with First Nations people, right? There are ways in which I benefit because of the color of my skin, because of my race or ethnicity, in ways that Indigenous people do not benefit. And that has to do with the way that society is constructed, and has to do with the way society operates. And so I don't have to do anything in order to benefit from the way society works. I don't have to be racist against Indigenous people. I don't have to go out of my way to disadvantage them. I don't have to go out of my way to try to get more advantages. I don't really have to do anything. I don't have to even like the fact that I benefit from the way society is constructed, okay? I don't have to do anything. It just has to do with the fact that I am a member of one group and other people are a member of another one, okay? And so I'm not saying that that situation can't be changed. I'm not saying that there's nothing I can do, because there is, but I am saying that I don't have to do anything in order to be part of this kind of relationship, okay? Does that make some sort of sense? Because let me know if that makes sense or not, because it's a tricky thing to understand. I think it's something that some people have a lot of issues understanding because it's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable for me to it's uncomfortable for me to feel that I don't like the fact that there is an inequality in Canada. I don't like that Indigenous people are disadvantaged and discriminated against in Canadian society. I don't like that. I don't agree with it. I don't approve of it. But I'm still part of it all the same, right? Just because I don't like it doesn't mean that I'm not a part of the system, and it doesn't mean that I don't get advantages from that situation. Okay, that's a tricky thing to understand, and it's an uncomfortable thing to understand too, because most people don't like to see themselves that way, and that's one of the things that Jane Elliott was pointing out in her interview with Jimmy Fallon, right? She said that, she kind of gets annoyed when people come up to her and say, well, I'm not racist. And nobody wants to, not nobody, most people don't want to be racist. They don't want to think of themselves as racist. So we really want to feel like we're the good guy, right? And so, but what I'm saying here is that oppression has to do with how society is built and kind of where you fit into the machine of society. And so you can, if you're in the dominant group, and this works for race, it works for gender, it works for sexuality, whatever dominant group that you might belong to, you have some advantages because of that. And again, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to like it. It kind of just happens because of the way society works. But that's not to say that that can't change. Okay? So again, it's a tricky thing to understand, and sometimes, depending on the social groups you belong to, it's an uncomfortable thing to understand, but it's something that we should remember, okay? So I showed you this little chart here that explained, these are kind of the oppressive relationships that we see, probably most specifically in Western European and North American countries, right? So here in Canada and the US, for instance, and in Europe, white people are the dominant group, and non-white people, who we kind of generally classify as peoples of color, which is not a perfect categorization, but we can deal with that later. The relationship between those two groups is described by racism, right? So I said that because these relationships are about power, you can't have the reverse happening, right? So you can't have reverse racism, because even if people of color have prejudicial ideas towards white people, even if they discriminate against white people, they still can't oppress them, because it's the white people who have power in society, social and institutional power. And so, so oppression only goes one way. It goes from the group with power to the group with no power, and it doesn't go both ways, okay? So there's lots of different types of oppression depending on the social group you belong to. We'll talk about a few more of these as we go through the course, okay? And so, again, what oppression is that it occurs when one group has legal and historical and social and institutional power. And so because one group has that power, they get to enforce their ideas on society, okay? They get to spread their own social messages. They get to create society in a way that advantages them and disadvantages others. And so oppression is much more than, simply a racist person here or there, or someone discriminating against someone in a certain instance. Oppression is societal level, right? It's big, it's structural, okay? Okay, so we were reading this article. I asked you some questions here. I'll just kind of catch us up. Yesterday we said a stereotype was kind of a generalization we make about people, sometimes based on physical characteristics, sometimes based on other characteristics, but basically stereotypes allow us to think we understand people based on what we see, okay? And so if we see a black person or a white person or a woman or an older person or a gay person or an immigrant or a Muslim or a Catholic, stereotypes allow us to think that we understand what those people are like, okay? And again, that's not true. Some stereotypes have a little grain of truth in them, some don't, but really they're generalizations. We said that prejudice was a little different, though. Prejudice had to do with a positive or negative judgment towards people. And so I said that a stereotype could be the fact that, well, you know, Canadians say a lot, right? They say a at the end of their sentences, a. And that's not really a prejudicial statement because it doesn't really say anything good or bad about Canadians. It just says something about the way Canadians are. They say a lot. But prejudice has to do with value judgments, right? And so Jane Elliott in her class, she created a prejudicial statement, right? She said that blue-eyed kids were not as smart as brown-eyed kids. They were kind of dumb. They weren't as good as brown-eyed kids. That's kind of a prejudicial statement, okay? Now, sometimes there's a little bit of gray area between stereotypes and prejudice, but prejudice has emotional value, okay? Prejudices have judgment attached to them. So I think the last question we talked about here yesterday was number 3. And so in this experiment in Jane Elliott's class, pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. So Jane Elliott creates this prejudice that brown kids are smarter and better, and blue-eyed kids are not as smart and not as good. And so we said that what was interesting was the brown-eyed kids started to perform better in class, right? They started to be better behaved. They started to get higher scores on their tests. And the blue-eyed kids started to do less well, and they started to act out. And we said, that's really interesting because there is no connection between intelligence and eye color, right? There should be no correlation. There should be no connection between those two things. But if you looked at the test scores, in Jane Elliott's Mark book, you would think that there was, right? So what's going on? Well, there's a prejudicial idea circulating in society, and people believe it, right? And this goes back to socialization. See, Jane Elliott was socializing her children to believe something, and then they started to see the world that way, and they started to see themselves that way. And so brown-eyed kids started to see themselves as more intelligent, right? They thought, either consciously or subconsciously, they thought, hey, I'm smart, I can do well on my math test. And they did well on their math test. Blue-eyed kids thought, oh, I'll probably fail, I'm not very smart. And they did it, and they didn't do as well. And so something really interesting happens when a social idea is spread, people internalize it, and then sometimes they start to act it out, right? They start to feel that it is true, even though it's not, right? And Jane Elliott's experiment is very simple, and it happened with grade 3 kids. So how old are they? Maybe 8 or 9 years old. They're just kids, but this kind of dynamic, this way of spreading social messages and people absorbing those messages and then acting based on those messages, that happens in real life. That happens in larger society in a more complicated way, yes, but you can see the same kind of pattern happening, and that's why her experiment is so interesting. Okay, so number 4, I asked you here, why do stereotypes remain so stable? Oh, we talked about this yesterday too, sorry. Why do stereotypes remain so stable over time? And we said that one of the things it had to do with was confirmation bias, right? People notice things and remember things that conform to the beliefs that they already have, okay? And so if you believe that Americans are sort of loud and boisterous, then every time you meet a loud American, you will remember it. You'll say, "Oh yeah, that proves my belief." But every time you meet a quiet American, you won't really notice it, right? You'll dismiss it. You won't remember. You'll think, "Oh, they're just an exception, right? They're an exception to the rule." But really, Americans are really noisy. And so, because you have this belief, you will your brain will work to confirm it. And so every time you see something that confirms your belief, you'll remember it. And when you don't, you'll ignore it. And again, this is an artifact of the way human brains work. It's not really a good thing when you're trying to understand complicated issues. It gets in the way. But our brains are prone to doing this. Our brains do like to confirm things that we already know. And so sometimes we have to be on guard about that. Help me out here. Help me remember. Why else did we say that stereotypes remain so stable over time? Why else did we say that? Help me, I forget. Let's see. Yeah, so Casey said, yeah, it's difficult to break down once formed. That is true. Why is that? There's the confirmation bias thing. Let me actually look here. Right. So the article listed a couple things. There was confirmation bias. You have a bad memory. That's okay. That's why we write things down, right? That's why we write things down. Manish says, if they're believing it for a long time, people continue to do so. Yeah, people don't like to change their beliefs, right? Especially when they are very deeply held. That is true. People don't like to question their beliefs. They like to hold on to them, sometimes very tightly. The article also talks about the self-fulfilling prophecy. And so this is actually connected to Jane Elliott's little experiment. In her class, there was a stereotype. Karen says here, Karen, it was told to us by people we trust. Yeah, sometimes our stereotypes and prejudices are sort of passed down to us from family members, right? Family members are responsible for teaching us, for socializing us. And so sometimes we absorb those messages either explicitly, so directly, or sometimes indirectly, but we learn them from people we trust. And so mouth to mouth, yeah, we pass them on, right? And so just as we pass on culture and values and norms and beliefs, we also pass on our stereotypes and prejudices too, right? All of those things get passed down generation to generation. The Jane Elliott thing, the self-fulfilling prophecy, in her class, there is a prejudice, there's a stereotype that brown-eyed kids are smarter. And so what happens? The brown-eyed kids perform better, right? That confirms the stereotype, and it allows it to get passed on because people believe it. They see the evidence of it. And so sometimes the idea comes and then people conform to it, and it confirms that the stereotype is true. Okay, so this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy thing that happens. Okay, number 5. We didn't talk about this yesterday. There are 4 functions of prejudice. What are they? 4 functions of prejudice. And if you can tell me what they mean, that'd be good too. So, what are the 4 functions of prejudice? Just give me one at a time if you can, or just give me any one and we'll deal with them. 4 functions of prejudice. So Baha says avoidance. Knowledge function. Baha, I'm not sure. Baha, I'm not sure that yours is one of them. Casey's knowledge function is one of them, right? What does that mean? What does that mean, knowledge function? Here we go. So Erica's got it. Knowledge function, with attitude, we think we understand what we are seeing. Yeah, that is true. So what they're trying to say here is that one of the uses, one of the functions of stereotypes is that it helps us to understand and know about the world that we live in, right? And so when we meet an older person, let's say, and we kind of see what they're like, and then we see what older people are like, and then people tell us what older people are like, then we kind of form this idea, and it helps us to understand how the world works, right? It helps us to understand how old people are and how young people are, and so it kind of gives us a shortcut to understanding people. Again, they're not always right, but stereotypes and prejudices help us to kind of learn about the world around us. So Baha says there's an adjustive function, okay? And Casey, your attitude is based on experience. I think that's knowledge function. I think it's knowledge function. So Baha says there's an adjustive function. What does that mean? What does that mean? So stereotypes and prejudices serve an adjustive function. And so what does that mean? How are stereotypes and prejudices useful? Okay. Karen says they change due to socialization. Yeah, yes, maybe yes. Okay, I'm gonna help you out with these a little bit. So the second one is adjustive function. And so the idea there is that stereotypes and prejudices It rewards actions. That's true. And so it has something to do with um, the idea of socialization and certain values and norms and rewarding and punishing behavior. Okay, so you may have your own example of this, but my example of adjustive function is I come from Edmonton, which is in Alberta. It's the next province over. And the two major cities in Alberta are Calgary and Edmonton. They both have sports teams. They both have a hockey team and a football team. And there's a rivalry between those two cities. And so if you live in Edmonton, then you have to hate the Calgary Flames, which is the hockey team, because that's kind of the prejudice you have, right? And if you live in Calgary, you have to hate the Edmonton Oilers, the hockey team there, because that's kind of the prejudicial idea. And so when you live in Edmonton and you say something mean about the Calgary hockey team, people laugh and make another joke back at you. They reward you, right? And same thing in Calgary. When you say something bad about the Edmonton Oilers, people will reward you or laugh or make another joke, because expressing those beliefs gets rewards or punishments, right? And so it's part of socialization. People get motivated to adopt the attitudes of their preferred group to gain approval. Exactly, right? So if you're in Edmonton, you will get approval, you will be rewarded if you're an Edmonton Oiler fan, right? If you're a Calgary Flames fan in Edmonton, you won't be rewarded. People will, give you weird looks and make comments about it. So that's the adjustive function. The third one is value expressive. And so this is based on the idea that part of our identity is tied up in what we think, right? And things that we like and things that we don't. And so sometimes we like to tell each other how we feel and how we think about things because it's a part of who we are, right? And when we give our opinions on what movies we like or what bands we like, or what we think about an issue, we're kind of expressing our identity, right? We're kind of expressing a little piece of who we are. And so that's what the value expressive function is about. And finally, there's an ego defensive function. So the idea there is that sometimes we use stereotypes and prejudices to make ourselves feel better. And so we might criticize another group or look down on another group to make ourselves feel better. And sometimes we do that with, sometimes humans do that. That's a thing that humans do, okay? Let me see here. Somebody tell me really quickly about Tajfel's social identity theory. How does this social identity theory work? Interestingly, we saw it work in Mean Girls, actually. Saw it work in Mean Girls. So how does Tajfel's social identity theory work? Pretty quiet out there. Are you typing? Are you confused? Have you fallen asleep? What's going on? What's going on out there, people? Okay. And it says, okay, so identifying a person's character. Okay. What else? What else? Casey says, people aim for positive self-image. Yeah, that's usually true, right? We usually want to see ourselves in a positive light, even though sometimes we criticize ourselves quite a bit. What else? How does this social identity theory work? In Mean Girls, the place that I think this social identity theory happens is when, well, maybe we don't see it, but there's that idea that the plastics, that they have to go shopping together and they have to pick out clothes together, because if you're going to buy a certain piece of clothing, then all the other girls have to agree to it, right? And why? Because people don't want to make mistakes. Yeah, that's true. They don't want to make mistakes, but they want to think of themselves positively, and so they also want to be part of a positive group. Okay, and so the girls in the plastics all make sure that they look good so that the group looks good as a whole, because if the group looks good, that means that each member of the group is good as well, right? So social identity theory has is that people try to maintain a positive social identity by maintaining a positive group identity. And so the plastics make sure that they all look good all the time and that they all are wearing kind of stylish clothes, because if the group looks good, that means that each individual member is good as well, right? They all get positive self-image from that. Hopefully that made sense to you. I'm going to leave number 7 and I'm just going to go on a little bit, okay? So we've been through this. We've reviewed this already, that stereotypes are reduced or simplified characteristics of a group. And again, they have no positive or negative attachment or judgments attached to them. But prejudices are a little different, right? This is where we are judging people or groups, right? So we have kind of an emotional attachment to this idea, and we're saying that things are good, or people or groups are sort of good or bad because of a certain reason. And again, they can be positive as well, right? There is a prejudicial idea floating around that Asians are really good at math, right? That's actually a positive stereotype, right? It says something good about a certain group of people. Now, whether or not that's true, it's kind of unfair, because it gives people an unfair advantage or an unfair disadvantage. So prejudicial ideas aren't really useful, whether they're positive or whether they're negative, okay? And finally, discrimination. Now, discrimination occurs when we actually act on our prejudices, okay? So we actually do something or don't do something based on the prejudicial ideas that we hold. Now, we can do this intentionally, or we can do it unintentionally. We can do it unintentionally, or we can do it intentionally, and it can be positive or negative. So we can positively discriminate. So we might include someone because of a certain idea that we have about them, or we might exclude someone for that reason as well. And we'll come back to that in just a... Will we come back to that in just a second? Okay, hang Um, so again, prejudice comes into play when we assign value to our stereotypes. And most of us want to think that we don't hold prejudicial thoughts, but I think if we kind of dug into our subconscious, we would find that most of us do have prejudicial ideas in there. And again, this is where I want to make that connection to the metaphor of software, right? So our culture is kind of our operating system, and some of the ideas we pick up kind of run in the background, like a computer virus or like malware. And so we don't really know that they're there. They're kind of operating in the background, and we don't really know what they're doing. And so sometimes prejudicial ideas are like that. They find their way into our programming without us really realizing that they are there or that they're operating. Um, so let me show you one example of a prejudice, okay? So prejudices vary and change over time, right? So some stereotypes remain very stable. Prejudicial ideas remain very stable, but expressing them, the ability to express those ideas changes over time. And part of the reason it changes is because many, how do I phrase this? The ability of people to actually express their prejudices publicly has to do with the idea of whether those prejudices are seen as true or not. Okay, so if you went back to the 1930s or 40s in the United States, you would see people who were very comfortable expressing their prejudice toward Black Americans. And the reason they were so comfortable doing it is because many people honestly felt that Black people were inferior to white people, that they were less than, they were not as intelligent or not as hardworking or whatever. And so people would express that idea very openly. Of course, now we know that there's no truth to that at all. There's no, Black people and white people are equal. And so you see that most people will not express that prejudice if they happen to hold it. But we do see some prejudices expressed very clearly in society today. And the reason why those prejudices are expressed is because they're seen as fact. Okay, so let me give you an example here. There currently is a prejudice toward people who are overweight, and particularly women. And for some people feel very comfortable expressing their prejudice toward people who are overweight, particularly women, because they see it as okay, right? It is okay to express this prejudice. So here's a good example here. So this is, I think this is Tess Holliday, right? So back in October 2018, Tess was on the cover of Cosmopolitan, and there were a lot of opinions about that. I don't know if anyone reads Cosmopolitan or anything similar to it, but most of the models that we see on the cover of Cosmopolitan are slim, right? And Tess is not that. And so when she made the cover of Cosmo back in October 2018, a lot of people had a very negative reaction to it. And so this guy here, Piers Morgan, he says that this is he's disapproving of her on the cover, and he's saying that this is really celebrating unhealthy lifestyle, right? This is her being on the cover is saying it's okay to be overweight, even though that's really unhealthy. But I'm not sure that that's really what's going on here with Tess. I'm not sure that Piers Morgan is necessarily concerned about Tess's health. I think he's more expressing a prejudice against people who are overweight. And you don't have to look very far to see more of this prejudice being kind of spread around. And so here's a tweet from a few years back. So, dear obese PhD applicants, if you don't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. So here, Jeffrey Miller is pretty clearly expressing his prejudice against overweight people. And the idea behind his prejudice here is not concern for their academic career. He's saying something about their character, right? So this is a prejudicial idea, right? He's looking at someone who is overweight and he's saying, I see you, I get some visual information with my eyes, and that means I know something about you, right? I know who you are based on how I see you, okay? You see stuff like this, being fat is not beautiful, it's an excuse, right? And so what's the kind of statement behind that? Well, the statement is that if you are overweight, then somehow you are not working hard enough. There's something, you're lazy, or you're not very conscientious with your food, or something like that. You see memes like this here. Life is like a box of chocolates. It doesn't last long for fat people. That's kind of a mean thing to say. Here's Dr. I'm going to put doctor in quotes, but Dr. Phil, he says, you're fat. Don't try to sugarcoat it because you'll eat that too. That's not a very nice thing to say. And of course, the question is, why do people feel so free to express their prejudice? And again, because these people feel that they're acting on factual information, right? They're looking at people who are overweight and they're saying, I know something about what's inside based on what's outside, right? So if you are, the belief here is that if someone is overweight, that they are lazy or not very intelligent, or that they don't care about themselves or their health, or they don't have any discipline, or they don't have any willpower, or they just can't be bothered to work hard, right? There's a very direct connection between how someone appears and their kind of internal characteristics, who they are, right? That's the prejudice that these people are expressing. And yeah, and this is, so the other part of it, I guess, is that who gets to say that they're overweight, and where's the weight limit, right? So where's the line between people who are normal and people who are overweight? We're not there yet. But I guess, spoiler alert, answer for that is that in all cases, no matter what kind of prejudice you're dealing with or what type of oppression you're dealing with, the dominant group always gets to decide who's in the dominant group, okay? We'll see that in the racism unit. White people get to decide who is white, okay? And that may sound confusing, but it won't sound confusing next week when we kind of pull it apart. Who gets to decide who's overweight? Probably not people who are round. It's the slim people who get to decide where the boundary is. And I'm not saying that's fair. I'm just saying that's kind of the way things happen. So in some way, what I'm trying to kind of demonstrate with this is that there's really no difference here between people expressing a prejudice based on people who are overweight than people who are expressing their prejudice against Black Americans decades ago. But I do not believe that they're like that. It's only their, yeah, and that's kind of what I'm going to say here, Baha, is that there are any number of reasons why someone's body shape is the way it is, right? Some of it has to do with diet, some of it has to do with exercise, some of it has to do with stress, some of it has to do with genetics, some of it has to do with environment, some of it has to do with social class and how much money you have. There's all kinds of different variables to how people's bodies appear. But for people who are expressing these kind of prejudicial or hurtful statements, they're basically collapsing it into a very simple stereotype, right? And the stereotype is that fat people are lazy and stupid and undisciplined, right? That's the very basic prejudicial idea that people are expressing. But then why do they express this? Because it is seen as fact, right? The idea is that, it's unhealthy to be overweight, and so we just want you to be healthy, and we want everyone to be healthy. And it's like, that's a nice sentiment, that's a nice thing to say, but I don't think that's why they are saying it. And so back to Tess Holloway's Tess Holloway's magazine cover. Piers Morgan isn't tweeting this because he's concerned about Tess's health. He's expressing it because he wants to express his prejudice against people who are overweight, right? And he wants to express his idea that this isn't beautiful, this isn't healthy, and that she shouldn't be seen, right? And this actually goes to Baha's comment here. So, Baha, you said that who says they're overweight, and and who gets to say, right? And it's kind of interesting to think that with people who are, well, with all people really, the beauty and entertainment industry in the Western world is massive, right? Look at the numbers there. The beauty industry is a $532 billion industry, and the health and wellness industry is a $4.2 trillion industry. And so both of those industries, so all of that money and all of that business is focused on trying to convince people that there is one version of what beautiful is, right? Beautiful is this thing, right? Maybe it's skinny and white and blonde and blue eyes, right? Maybe that's what beauty is. Or what should a person's body look like? Well, it should look like this, right? And if you don't look like those things, then those industries can sell you all kinds of products in order to make you beautiful or to make you fit. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't take care of your health, and I'm not saying, it's definitely not bad to make yourself up and make yourself feel pretty. That's fine. But there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of money trying to convince people that certain things are attractive and desirable and certain things aren't. And so when someone like Tess is on the cover of Cosmopolitan, some people will express their prejudice in the name of health. But again, it's not health, it's expressing a prejudicial idea of judgment, right? It's saying that you shouldn't be on the cover of this magazine because you are overweight, and being overweight means that you are stupid or lazy or whatever, right? And so those prejudicial ideas are very clearly expressed because people are connecting being overweight with not taking care of yourself, with not eating properly and not exercising. And again, like Baha mentioned, there's actually a lot of reasons why people's bodies are the way they are, right? And they have to do with a lot of different factors. It's not simply that someone is lazy, okay? But again, people will express that prejudice because they think it's a fact, right? They think they're not being prejudicial, they're just saying what's true. And again, there's a grain of truth to that. Being really overweight can be difficult on your body in a number of different ways, and you can have some influence on your body based on your activity and what you eat. But there's a lot of other variables to it as well, right? So this massive industry that controls social messaging, that tells us what's beautiful and what's not, is trying to sell us things based on this very narrow idea of what beautiful is. Um, and so, as I'm mentioning here, there's a pretty big economic interest in maintaining these prejudices, right? Lots of companies would go out of business if people weren't so concerned about their appearance, particularly women, and if people stopped spending so much money trying to alter their appearance. Okay. All right. So the next thing we'll talk about is discrimination, but I think we're kind of I think I'm probably going to leave it there. We didn't do a break because we kind of started class a little bit differently today. So I'll end a little early for you. Tomorrow we'll talk about discrimination, and I'll show you a few instances of how discrimination works. And then I've also got some stuff tomorrow. I want to start us going on one of our little micro papers, which we need to get working on. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. We'll sort of pick up this oppression and power. We'll talk about discrimination. I've got a few interesting examples for you to show you how it works. And then we'll talk about the micro papers thing. So how are we? Does that make sense? Is that okay with everyone? Do you have any questions? Do you want to add something? Do you agree with things I said? Do you disagree with things I said? Yeah, what do you think? Comments, thumbs up, thumbs down, questions. Thumbs up from Karen. Okay. Nothing to add for Ba. Okay. Sam's good. That emoji doesn't come up for some reason. I don't know why. Same thing with Dika. Everyone's good. Casey's good. Sheet is good. I hope I did a good job with explaining that the prejudicial idea with people who are overweight. And I know it's a little bit complicated, and I'm not sure I nailed it, but hopefully that made some sort of sense to you. So Manish is good. Okay. Okay. All right. I'll leave it there. I think we've agreed that we'll do racism next, and so that's probably what we'll start with on Monday. Finish oppression and power this week. Talk about the micropaper thing tomorrow. Yeah, but until then, it was really nice to talk to all of you. And I'll see you in comparative cultures, or I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so bye.